welcome to Amrita by the Book. My name is Amrita and this is my booktube where today I'd like to talk about a few movies by Alfred Hitchcock that were adapted from books. Hitchcock made some of my all-time favorite movies with some of my all-time favorite actors, and I grew up watching him, and it made perfect sense when I grew up and realized that some of his most dearly beloved classics were actually adapted from novels of the time, and that he was actually a voracious reader. I will not be discussing all his adaptations because although I have seen all his movies, I have not read all the books that the movies were adapted from. So before I launch into the 5 movies that I'm going to be talking about today, I'd like to just give an honorable mention to the movies that I won't be discussing today. First, there is Psycho, which is based off a book by Robert Bloch. I think that's how you pronounce his name. And this was actually inspired by a real-life serial killer who also went on to inspire the... do you remember the trans character in The Silence of the Lambs? The one who was starving and then killing and skinning women to make like a woman suit. Yeah, that's based on a real character, a real man who lived just down the road from the author of this book, and he was so profoundly impacted by the horrible story that he ended up writing Psycho, which became a huge hit, and then Hitchcock got his hands on it and then made the film. Next up is the book that inspired Vertigo, and it's actually a French book called D'entre les morts by Boileau-Narcejac. And this is a writing duo out of France whose works were translated into English, and I believe Hitchcock was a huge fan of their work. I've never read any of their novels, but I kind of want to. And those of you who are fluent French speakers out there, because I know there's like more than a couple of you, maybe, you know, the next time that you want to read a murder mystery, you should look up some of their work because they sound fascinating. Next, everyone's old favorite, To Catch a Thief, starring Cary Grant and Grace Kelly. I mean, this is the last word in cool, right? But it is based off a book by a writer called David Dodge, who wrote travel books actually, and his first passion was actually traveling, but he didn't have the money to do it, so he decided he would just write a quick beach read kind of novel. And it caught the attention of Hitchcock, who turned it into a film. And Hitchcock rather famously underpaid his writers, you know, like he was notorious for keeping his name out of negotiations in case it drove up the price so that he could get the rights for real cheap, and I'll talk about that in a bit. But Dodge didn't actually care. Like, all he wanted to do was travel and write about it. So I guess everything worked out. And really, like, you know, Hitchcock did that thing where he got a book and then he used it as a sort of loose frame for the story that he wanted to tell, and everything worked out in the end. So those are the 3 books that I won't be discussing today, but now let's go on to the main 5. First up is Strangers on a Train by Patricia Highsmith, and I didn't read Patricia Highsmith until I was an adult. Like, she wasn't somebody I grew up reading, and I didn't know that she had written the novel that inspired the book. Well, it didn't inspire the book. He got the rights to it, and he got it for real cheap. Like I was saying before, like, he kept his name out of the negotiations, and I think she sold it to him for like, I don't know, $7,500 or something. I mean, dirt cheap. And she was not amused when she realized who had bought the rights at the end. But this is like one of those movies by Hitchcock that gets discussed all the time because there is so much craziness going on. It's basically the story of this guy who's stuck in an unhappy marriage, and one day he bumps into this guy on the train who strikes up a conversation with him and then says, oh, you know what, I've just devised the perfect murder. Like, I don't know you and you don't know me, and we'll just exchange information, and then I'll come to your house and murder your wife, and then you can come to my house and murder my wife, and nobody will know who murdered whom because we don't even know each other, and there's nothing to connect the two of us. You know, it's just the perfect crime. And then, he goes on with it because, it's just one of those weird conversations that you have in a public place with, or a semi-private place with a total stranger. And then to his horror, the stranger goes through with it, and then comes this entire psychological thriller about like, what's he gonna do? It is a fascinating film, and it's a great book. Like, this was actually Patricia Highsmith's debut novel, and it is fantastic, and I recommend it to everybody. And also, there is a video by Lana, and I'm going to link down to that below because it's fascinating. And I'm going to let Lana explain her video to you because it's complicated and interesting, and it actually inspired this video. So thanks, Lana, you're a peach as always, and you should all try watching her video too because it's so interesting. The next adaptation is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, and so du Maurier again was like one of Hitchcock's favorite authors. He went back to her time and again. He made Jamaica Inn, and he also set The Birds, which is another story that I'm going to be talking about in a bit, on one of her short stories. And she wasn't always happy with his adaptations, like she kind of hated most of them. But Rebecca was the one that she was actually really happy with because he really captured the atmospheric feel of it, because if you've read du Maurier, and if you haven't, I highly recommend you do. She has this atmosphere in all her books that are just incredible, and you just sink into it, and there's a feeling of like dread, but it's sort of intertwined with her descriptions of place. And her books are mostly set in Cornwall. I think they're all set in Cornwall actually, anyway, but she manages to turn Cornwall into something that is both, like you have a feeling of anxiety and dread when you read it, but also it sounds beautiful. I recommend the book, I recommend the film. I do not recommend the Netflix adaptation, so everything but that. Next up is a difficult one, and it's Marnie. And Marnie is a book written by an author called Winston Graham, whose work I am not familiar with apart from this one particular book. And I kind of thought twice about including it in this list, but then I thought it was important too because like I said, I love Hitchcock's movies, but I can't in all good conscience talk about his work and recommend his work without also pointing out that he was also an awful person who did terrible things. And it's not even like, oh, he was terrible in the context of his time. No, he's terrible at like any point of time. The only difference is that he got away with it because he lived in a time when men had even less scrutiny than they do today. So Marnie was originally conceived of as a vehicle for his favorite blonde, which is Grace Kelly. But Grace Kelly had just decided to become a princess, and so she wasn't coming back to shoot this movie. And so it's a movie that stars Tippi Hedren and Sean Connery. And it's one of those weird, like mid-20th century psychology things. And Hitchcock loved it. He's made multiple movies about the psychology of characters and how people are kind of going crazy and like, why are they crazy and stuff like that. And in this one, you have Tippi Hedren, who is playing a woman who has problems with her sexuality. The word that they used back then is frigid. And then it turns out that she had all this childhood trauma, and that's why she can't bear to be touched by men. And this was a thing that really intrigued Hitchcock because he had a fondness for the ice cold blondes. And of course, he knew exactly what he was doing by casting her opposite Sean Connery, who at the time was James Bond, and everybody wanted to get in Sean Connery's pants. And it is singularly significant in his filmography because of the way that he treated Tippi Hedren over the course of this book, and then the other movie being The Birds. This is not a Hollywood secret. It is something that everyone knows, and I think Tippi Hedren herself has talked about this. And it's just a horrible, horrible thing. And also, this is a book and a movie that employed something that my friends and I call concern rape, which is a trope that you'll see in the I don't know when it started. I think it started somewhere in maybe the 50s and then sort of leveled up through the decades until the 80s when it just became full-blown rape fantasy. But it's a thing where a woman has some kind of issue. You know, it could be a medical issue, it could be a psychological issue, it could be a physical issue, a moral issue. And the only way that you can fix this woman is by raping her. And it's usually the hero that does it, and he does it for her own good. And eventually she forgives him and they live happily ever after. And it is one of the things that just makes my skin crawl. And it was employed by pretty much everybody, like men and women. Like if you look at the Harlequin and Milton Boone romances of the 80s, and I would say slipping over into the 90s, it's pretty rife. And a lot of those authors are still writing today. So it's not that long ago, and it is, yeah, it's bad. And within the, the confines of this particular film, it's Sean Connery, whom everybody wants to sleep with at this point of his career. And then there's Tippi Hedren, Marnie, who doesn't. So, it's that whole like conversation between the film and the context in which it exists. So it's a fairly fascinating film to discuss, but also as a piece of filmmaking and as a piece of filmmaking by a man who behaved in reprehensible ways, it is terrible. So choose your boundaries and God bless. Next is The 39 Steps, which is a thriller that was written by John Buchan, and I believe this has never been out of publication since it was first printed, and for good reason, And I think, the movie itself is actually pretty darn great, and it has these scenes that are very famous in film circles, and everybody will talk about it. And it's really a classic of its genre, and I recommend it. Like, Hitchcock is one of those people that I have no qualms recommending to modern audiences because his style of filmmaking has gone on to inform a lot of things that we see in modern filmmaking today. So you sometimes watch classic cinema and you're just like, well, I don't get it. Like, this is so dated and stiff and foreign to me, even though if it's, it could be like your own culture. But Hitchcock, for whatever reason, really translates well to a modern audience. So if you are thinking about widening your journey into classic cinema, I would 100% recommend a Hitchcock movie, and I would recommend this one if you like thrillers. But I would also recommend the book because it's been a while since I read it, but I remember it being a classic of its genre. But it doesn't have that sexiness, that Hitchcock liked to put in his films. Hitchcock knew what sold, basically. Like, he knew what people like to see. So there is a difference between the film and the book. And that reminds me, when they were making Marnie, like I said in the previous segment, it went through a bunch of rewrites from a bunch of different writers, and all of them were trying to handle the rape scene in the middle of the book because even back then they knew that was terrible, So they were trying to erase the marital rape scene, and then the person who eventually wrote it is this fascinating woman, and she basically cottoned on, and she knew exactly what he wanted. She was like, well, the only reason he's making this film is because of that scene, that's what interests him about that book, the sexual violence and what it means psychologically. Like I've often said before, you can have very complicated relationships with media that you consume. And Marnie and the work of Hitchcock in general is one of them. And the last one that I'd like to recommend today is The Birds, which is based off a short story by Daphne du Maurier called The Apple Tree. If you haven't read it and you like horror, then this is a really great short story and you should check it out. It's about this man who is a veteran and he's come back from the war, and he finds himself in this tiny village that is being dive bombed by all these birds, and there's no real understanding of why they're doing it, but they're out to get every single human that they can. And it's a very early example of ecological horror, but it also resonates for the England of the time, because England had just survived the Second World War and you had the German Blitz, so you had all these German planes that were bombing them. So it sort of evoked a very recent horror and nightmare, but also married it to this very benign and beautiful part of nature. And it has a very complex and interesting interplay with nature writing and England, which is like something that you'll see come up over and over again with British literature, the role that nature plays in their literature. And it's super interesting and it's really short, so you should try that. But Hitchcock got it and he turned it into this really weird but still interesting thing about class and about misogyny almost, and I don't know, it's been a while since I saw the movie and I need to go back and rewatch it, but I feel like there is a whole comment to be made about the way that he treated Hedren during the making of this film. He punished her by basically having her attacked by real birds, and she was scratched up, she had scratches all over her face, and she was terrified, and it was traumatic in the extreme for her. If you do watch The Birds and you notice these themes, let me know what you think, because I think it's interesting. So those were my 5 Hitchcock adaptations that I've read the books of, and let me know if you have seen any of them. Do any of them sound interesting to you? Would you rather read the book versus watch the film? I mean, I recommend both, like these are all books by incredibly accomplished writers from the 20th century. And also these are incredibly accomplished films by a master of his craft. It's just that when you are dealing with somebody like Hitchcock, who has left such a giant imprint, you need to understand that there are different facets, and some of them are laudable and some of them are despicable, and you might feel differently. And I know that there are Hitchcock fans out there who are crazy protective of his legacy, and if that pisses you off, I'm sorry, but this is the way things roll around here. For more videos, please hit the subscribe button.